Ready to go?
We're ready to go.
Well, thank you and good evening. Today's work session is in regards to our pavement preservation plan. For some of the new council members, we started this program with SRF and Brown Intertech quite a few months ago. So some of the information is going to be a little redundant and was previously presented, I believe. Is that fair? But we detailed it out to more of what the funding assets and everything, funding levels in conjunction with our conditional index. So Molly Stewart from Brown Intertech will be, and Amy Roadhouse is from here from Brown Intertech. They'll give you a presentation on this PowerPoint. So feel free, I always say, answer any questions anytime during any of the slides. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brian. I'm Molly Stewart. I'm with SRF Consulting. So we teamed together with Braun to put together this pavement preservation study for the city. And like Brian mentioned, it is a little redundant for those that got to see this presentation back in August, I believe it was. But for the new faces, this should be new information. So without further ado, so preserving and maintaining a city's roadway is very complex. Transportation systems have become expensive to maintain due to rising costs of materials and aging roadways and funding sources that are maybe declining and or stagnant. So given that, a lot of cities are faced with decisions on which roadways they want to maintain and where they want to be spending their money. So the point of our study today was to kind of look at what the city is currently doing as far as pavement preservation goes and what type of funding they have available and trying to maximize it in the most efficient way possible so that the roadways can be maintained to the best quality they can be. So the study, as part of the study, we utilize what existing tools are out there that the city is utilizing, the data that they collect currently, taking into account the pavement conditions that are out there today, and historic data, and then tried to look at new ways we could come up with some ideas for the city to maximize their funding. And our goal today is to try and get some feedback from you guys on what we have done thus far and what the results show, which will be discussed later in the presentation, and see what kind of feedback we have before we move into a wrap-up of the study. So pavement preservation is a key component of system management. Basically, the concept of pavement preservation is that all roadways have a finite life. Once you lay down the pavement, it will deteriorate at a set rate, and that's kind of dictated by the type of traffic that's on the roadway, the soil conditions, the weather conditions. So roadways that have higher volumes tend to deteriorate faster, or if they're in conditions where the soils might not be as great, they also tend to deteriorate faster. So with proper maintenance, though, roadways, that life can be extended, and it's really important to time that maintenance appropriately so that you maximize your funding when you're doing maintenance activities. But eventually, maintenance does have its limits, and roadways do need to be replaced eventually in their life cycle. So pavement preservation, the key priority, and it may seem counterintuitive, is to really focus on the pavements that are in fairly good condition still, where the maintenance that is required to maintain them is a lot less expensive than the pavements that are in a poorer condition, which are usually probably the ones you're hearing about more from the public anyway. So it's really important to focus on the fair and good paved roadways and try and do the lower cost maintenance strategies to maintain those and not let them fall into the poor condition. And then you really let those poor conditions kind of deteriorate to the point where you just need to reconstruct them, because a mill and overlay or a seal coat or some other preventative maintenance strategy isn't really going to do much for those types of roadways. So as part of this study, we took a look at all the paved roadways in the city and really tried to prioritize strategies and the roadways based on the current condition, and then really identify the appropriate life cycle for each one of the roadways based on, like I said, the traffic and the weather conditions and the types of soils and different conditions that the pavements are in, and then targeting the roadways at certain times so that we try to maximize the roadway conditions that are in the fair and good, keep them there, and then worry about where the reconstruction should go for the poor paved roadways. This graphic here just shows a little bit of kind of what I had talked about. So when you pave a roadway, this is typically, if you did no maintenance to it, it will deteriorate in a certain life cycle. And the next graph here, it shows the red line is corresponds to the previous one, but the blue line is if you were to do some preventative maintenance. Throughout the life cycle of the pavement, you get spikes in the cycle as you do different road maintenance activities. So the smaller spikes on the blue curve are things like a seal coat or a crack seal. They bump the quality of the pavement up a little bit, and then the larger jumps are if you were to do kind of like a mill and overlay or replace the total surface without reconstructing the roadway. It's lower cost than a full reconstruct would be, but you pretty much get a perfect road condition again, and then it kind of starts deteriorating again at that. So you can see how using properly timed preventative maintenance will help to extend the life cycle of your roadway by almost double. So in summary, pavement preservation is really is a proactive approach, trying to emphasize on protecting the city's investments and maximizing the funding that's available, and really aiming to try and extend the life of the roadways as long as possible before you're reconstructing the roadways, and also really trying to time projects where they're done and minimizing lengthy road constructions throughout the city. So that will reduce delays and congestion and impact on the public.
Brian, don't we kind of look at also what's under the roads at times, if it's old sewer, old water lines and stuff?
Absolutely. That's going to be our determination, our second tier, if we're going to even overlay it or anything too as well, based on utilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have a slide a little bit later that talks about how projects are kind of identified in utilizing the pavement management software the city utilizes, and one of them is the engineering factor. So is there a safety concern there? Is there a geometric deficiency, or does the water utility lines need to be replaced underneath? And those kind of all tie into making the decision. So with not just considering pavement surface, you also want to consider those factors as well too.
I think we still have some lead lines down there, don't we?
Well,
Going in the homes?
certainly. And yeah, as you know, it's all assessing risk, and there's some, I can't think of the name of the instances, but it happens. We try to overlay a street, and 5 years we have to cut into it. That's happened, unfortunately. But there is a risk assessment and all that.
Okay, thank you.
So part of the beginning phases of the study, we looked at what the city is currently doing, and as I mentioned a little bit ago, the city utilizes the ICON pavement management software to track their pavement quality. The city implemented this software in 2006, and it's kind of a web-based program that utilizes GIS data, and it's stored in an Access database. And then as new data is collected, such as pavement condition index data, which the city gathers on a every so often for their paved roadways, and then they also maintain, you can enter in as construction projects are completed and keep track of all the maintenance history, so that all factors into what ICON will take into account as they project out which roadways need certain types of maintenance done to them and when. So it understands, as I mentioned, the importance of proper timing of pavement preservation strategies such as seal coats and mill and overlays. And it really puts importance on maximizing the life cycle that's identified for each of the roadways so that you can really maximize the funding that's available. So we also were able to utilize this software, as I'll show later, to project out future conditions. So we'll do that as well. So if you plug in here's my budget and any factors you wanted, and it will project out a funding scenario if we put our money towards these types of roadways in this particular manner. It will tell you what you can predict for as far as pavement quality goes for your system. So getting into a little bit of the city's existing roadway conditions. This map shows all the city streets within Fergus Falls. They're broken into two different functional classes. Municipal state aid streets are the green ones, and municipal streets are the blue ones. So the difference between the two is pretty much the funding source. So state aid funding can be used for municipal state aid streets versus just local funds for the municipal streets. The city has a total of about 99 total miles of centerline miles of roadway within Fergus Falls, paved roadways. So as I mentioned, they're split by functional class, and it's important to classify roadways as it pertains to the different, the access and mobility relationship, as the graph on the right shows. So typically roadways that are, you want to have higher speeds and mobility tend to have less access points, so the city streets tend to fall into the lower, more access, less mobility, versus the freeways and expressways that tend to have less access, more mobility. And it's a way to seek and manage mobility and throughout the city, and making sure land uses are connected and you can connect around the city and stuff. And again, it's the funding source varies by whether it's state aid versus non-state aid streets. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Amy now to go through a little bit more.
Okay, so this is a graph of pavement age. Looking at this, so there's roughly 50% of the city's street network that's older than 25 years. So if you think back to that graphic that Molly had up that had the bumps going up and coming back down, and what this tells us is that roughly half the network is sort of at the end of the line. So it's at that point where we're at the end of the curve, and we're approaching the point where the repairs are much more expensive. In other words, we need to probably look at reconstruct as opposed to cheaper repair approaches like seal coat. So when we're looking at the city's network, one of the key components, in addition to the condition, is also the pavement age. So half of the system, again, is getting pretty old. These are pie charts of the city's historical pavement condition. So every 4 years or so, the city has a pavement evaluation done, where an evaluator goes out, looks at the different types of distresses that exist on the road, and then based on the type of distresses, each road gets what's called a PCI, a Pavement Condition Index. That goes from 0 to 100, where 0 is a failed pavement, 100 is a good pavement. So in 2007, the first evaluation was done of the city network. On average, the PCI was a 73. Another one over 12 and 13, where the score was a 69, and then again in 2015, where we're sitting at an average of about 70. And then you can kind of see the breakdown of what that average is composed of. So roughly 30-ish% is in excellent condition. Looks like we're at 46% in that good condition. And kind of the ones that we really are concerned with are the yellow, which is the fair. Those are your pavements that are kind of sitting right at the cusp of deteriorating into more expensive repairs if we don't catch them now. In other words, if we don't do something like a mill and overlay now, they're going to slip into that next category where we have to probably do reconstruct. So those are the ones we want to keep an eye on. So then what we did is we used the city's ICON pavement management program to project based on historical funding, what do we think the average of the condition would be today? So that's what this pie chart is here. So roughly at about a 60, so you can see how I think we were at a 70 in 2015, so we've dropped off quite a bit based on funding. And then again, now our most critical, those yellow ones in the fair condition, that's jumped to about 30% of the network. So we always get the question, what do these PCIs mean? What do they look like? It might be a little hard to see on the screen there, but these are just some pictures of actual Fergus Falls streets and what the different conditions are. So 90 obviously looks pretty good. There really isn't much pavement distress, maybe a few transverse cracks that just happen from the freeze-thaw cycle. And then you can see as the PCI goes down, we have more and more pavement distress. Looking at that one of 25, it looks like we're starting to get distresses that are indicative of structural type failures. So we definitely need to do more of an extensive repair treatment on those. Okay, so then we used ICON to sort of project out again into the future now. What do we think what is the city's network going to look like based on funding? So we initially developed a sketch tool where we looked at revenue sources that the city has. We're looking out 20 years, so out to 2038. We did apply a 3% inflation factor to the maintenance costs that you have, and then an inflation factor to the revenue sources. So bottom line, we ended up that our annual pavement preservation revenue is about $988,000. So that's what we have to spend on that 99 miles of paved streets to try and maintain them at the condition that they're at. So we did, our first scenario was at 988,000 again. We're looking out 20 years. We've got our inflation factors in there. And then just to give you a sense of what the different repair treatments cost, those are listed there on a per mile basis. So you can see seal coat is relatively cheap compared to the other repair approaches that we have. And then these are just the cost for the pavement itself, so other things like striping, utility repairs, curb and gutter, those things would have to get added on to those.
Maybe, can I just
Yeah.
pipe in on that
Yeah.
988,000? What's in that number is the amount we levy in our general fund, and then the state aid we receive that's kind of unrestricted for maintenance, right? That's a fair way of saying it. And then the money we also receive for state aid construction dollars. So it's the combination of those three that come up to that average of 988. So
Yeah, thanks.
it's a
Bill.
lot of
That's a good
state
point.
dollars
Yeah.
in that with our
Yeah.
local levy dollars.
Right. Okay, so then this is just a graphic of how we're scheduling maintenance for a road. So over on the left, we have the new construction, age 0, and then what we want to try and do, and again, if you think back to that sawtooth curve we were looking at, we want to time these different treatments at the appropriate years to try and stretch out the life of the pavement. So rather than getting, you know, let's say if we built the road now and just did nothing, we might get 20 years out of it. If we time the maintenance activities as shown here, we'll hopefully stretch it out to 50, 60 years. So that preservation schedule was entered into the pavement management program, and then we run these different scenarios. So the way that the system spends the money, or how it picks projects, is based on number 1, functional class. So higher functional class roads, the money goes to first. So in your case, the municipal state aid roads, the ones that have more traffic, that's where we're gonna look to spend the money first. And then it would go to the municipal streets after that. It does look at pavement condition, so weighing a road that's got a score of 20 versus a road that has a score of 80. And then also looking at the pavement age, so when was the last time we did a repair on a street, and can we do it again? You know, we're not gonna do things like mill and overlay this year and then mill and overlay again the next year. So, you know, it tries to space those out and time them appropriately. And then obviously it needs to look at funding. So if we get down to spending our entire $988,000, then there's no more left to spend. And then those projects go to a backlog list, which is kind of a running list of projects that you need to do but aren't funded by the budget that you have. And then Molly touched on this a little bit. So, you know, what's numbered there is 1, 2, 3, and 5. Those are kind of the things that the pavement management program is able to do. But it does obviously take an engineer to determine what is the best project to do, and that's where other factors come into play, like safety, drainage, utilities. Maybe you need to widen the road for traffic purposes or something like that. So that will ultimately dictate, you know, which projects you're gonna do.
So the good news for Brian, so we're not the
Brian?
engineers, correct?
Yes. Brian hopefully still has a job. You can pay me later.
You blush, you're so nice.
Okay, so the first scenario was, and again, in this scenario, we're spending just that $988,000, although we are increasing it by inflation each year. And then how we're spending it is to put roughly 20% to seal coating, and then 40% to mill and overlay, and 40% to recon. And then this is a table showing what happens to the average network condition if we were to spend that amount of money. So We've got the first 10 years on the left and then the next 10 years. And then you can see the budget. Keep an eye on that backlog, because again, that's the list of projects that really still need to be done. You know, those might be roads that have a PCI of 30 or 40 or 50, whatever, but we're not able to do them because we don't have enough money. So that goes from, and this is in thousands of dollars, so that goes from about 16,000, I'm sorry, 16 million to about 30 million over the course of 20 years. And then you can see what happens to the average PCI. In this scenario, it ultimately, by the final year, it's still the same, but you can see it does take a dip. Looks like the lowest it drops down to is about a 52. So I would say too, thinking back to those pictures of the different PCIs and what the road looks like, that's one of the things that the city needs to determine is what condition are you comfortable with, and what sort of PCI do you want to try and achieve. So then we, after discussions with Bill, we ran a second scenario, which was an increase in the general fund. And that was 52,000 in year 2019, and then it went up another 5% for the next 4 or 5 years. I don't know if you want to explain that further.
Where I came up with that? If you recall in the budget process, we increased the general fund street funding 20% or $52,000. So we took that and we said, we're gonna do a 20% increase in that general fund budget each year for 5 years in this 988. And then just inflationary increases in the state funding. I know as we talked as a council, that was a goal to try and let's do that 20% for a while. So I made the call, if we can do that for 5 years, I think we'll be doing good, because that's a lot, but I think it's important. But that's why I kind of chose the 5 years, in essence, to double our funding in 5 years for that. So that's the
Okay.
rationale behind that.
Thank you. So other than the funding, this scenario was exactly the same. We're spending the money the same way we did in that first scenario. So here's what happens. Our backlog is now ending at 21 million, so better than the 30 million. We've obviously been able to buy more projects with our money. And the average PCI actually increases to a 71. So then we looked at what if the city applied a franchise fee, and we used $1 per user with some input from Bill. That resulted in $144,000 per year that we could add to the budget. And again, everything else was left the same. This scenario does not include the tax increase that I just talked about in the last scenario. This is just the $988,000 plus the franchise fee. And this is just a little bit of info on franchise fees. It's authorized under state law, can be utilized for gas and electric. About 40% of cities in Minnesota do have a franchise fee that they apply. And yeah, just some other information there on that. And I think, I don't know if there's a limit how much you can increase the franchise fee, $2 a user, or
I don't know for sure. I know some other cities throughout the state. I think some of them even have had like
Yeah.
$4 a user.
Okay.
I think I've seen upwards of like $7 even,
Sure.
and some do it in like a percentage. They say of the users we do a 1% or they do it per dollar, and then it's based on, you can do it just to gas or just to electric or however variance on. It's kind of all over the place, but the important thing is that 40% of the cities throughout Minnesota do it, and then all the money can be used towards pavement management, and it's thinking it's almost $200,000 that you can collect just by doing $1. That's
If we were gonna go down that route, I mean, that would be an educational process. We would educate ourselves about that, and then we would educate the public about that before we went that road. What we've heard from other cities, it's been quite an education process, but that's worked very well, because by the time they got through that education process, people kind of went, yeah, that makes sense. And so it would be,
Yeah.
and it can be an alternative to say an assessment or something. So So
Right.
there's just, also another tool that can be used to collect money for pavement management, but it's, maybe a little bit different way.
So that would be, I mean, we'll talk about that, I'm sure, but we'll dedicate some time, wouldn't you say, Brian, of just even discussing that in a little more detail, so.
Brent, you had a question?
Well, that's kind of what I was wondering, because I had heard this before. And is this something that we could add above and beyond, so that way people are paying so much out of their utility bill each month, and then that way when something happens in front of their house, they're not going to get hit with assessments. There's going to be a fund set aside. This takes care of it, especially when you get people on fixed incomes and everything else like this. If it's something we could do in order to build up a fund to cover the assessment portion for the people, so they just don't get hit with assessments on their taxes.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, that, I think definitely could be. There are several, like, I live in a city that doesn't assess for roadway projects, so, which I appreciate, so, and definitely that can be done for that. I don't think there's stipulation, at least that I know of, that has to be used the year.
There are cities that have done that, just what you're saying, so.
Yeah.
Something else I was gonna point out, jumping back here, so with the dollar per user franchise fee, that brings in $144,000. If we look back at the cost to do 1 mile of projects, basically with that amount of money, the city could buy 12 miles of seal coat streets, so roughly about 10% of your system, and less than a mile of mill and overlay. So, and I think the tax increase was 52,000, right? So, yeah, so you can kind of see how much projects that buys you if the city does these increases. Okay, so this is the result of the, adding the $144,000 franchise fee per year to the budget. So we jumped from a 61 to a 67. Not quite as good as the tax increase scenario, which ended at a 71. And you can see our backlog kind of falls right in between the two. And then lastly, we did one final scenario where we added everything together. So we've got our $988,000 budget, the dollar franchise fee, and then the tax increase of $52,000. And the results of that are the average goes from a 61 to a 77, and the backlog is down to about 16 million by the end of the plan. So, I don't know if anybody has any questions, but I think that, yeah.
What do you see as like a statewide average? I mean, if we reach 77 PCI,
Yeah,
give us an idea of what that looks like in comparison to other communities in the state
Yeah.
of Minnesota.
it's a good question, and I think we talked about that after the last meeting, or, yeah. It varies. I've seen agencies shoot for an average of 60. I've seen agencies shoot for an average of 85. I would say the ones on the higher end are your newer suburbs that are probably only 20 years old or so. I don't know how old your system is roughly, but yeah, it varies, and I think I did send Brian some averages of some agencies that I had on hand.
So it'd be safe to say at 77 PCI in greater Minnesota, we're gonna be sitting pretty good.
Yeah, I would think so. I think, the thing, going back to those pictures, and again, I don't know how well you can see them, but I think it's a matter of,
It's acceptable.
what are you comfortable with? I don't have a 60 up here, but you can imagine it's where it falls. A good thing to do is, go out and, so each street block has its own PCI score, but to go out and, you can actually drive some of those and get a sense of what the different PCIs are.
I have a question, and I think this is probably gonna come up, but this is for Brian. In this study, let's say we went with that scenario 4, obviously we're gonna be enhancing dollars going into repair the streets, which would also take into consideration the repairs underneath the streets. And I know there's funds set aside for that, but the increase to this, is there enough funds set aside to do the infrastructure underneath the streets to keep up with this increase, or is that fund, because I know we have an aging system underneath, is that fund also backed up? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, but everything, not every street needs a new water main, not every, so it's a project specific, you know, and that's where the capital improvement plan, refining that a little bit more to have a working plan. So you have all those assets that need to be replaced or have that identified is probably the best course of action to start doing that trending and everything, so.
So it wouldn't necessarily mean with this increase, we'd also need to increase that fund to kind of keep up with the.
So when I come to you with a utility rate analysis, we have built in what our capital improvement plan is, you know, with what we know are some areas that need attention, and then we put some placeholders in as well. But like Brian just said, we want to even refine that more so that we every year update that and bring that to you. We don't want surprises. We want a nice laid out plan for utilities as well, and that's what we do every year. And we want to just continue to refine that. But long story short, we are planning for those as well. So we're definitely not forgetting about the utility lines. That happens in addition to all this through the utility rates, the water, the sewer, and the stormwater rates that you all pay on your utility bills. A portion of that goes to that infrastructure cost.
Any other questions? No? Okay, thank you. Brian, if you had anything else?
No, I can't think of it's probably a little bit,
Thank you, Amy, thank you,
Yeah,
Molly.
thank you.
it's a lot of information to digest. Amy and Molly have done a great job on this and using data, our city's information that we've had, but getting it all, removing all the erroneous stuff. Amy did a lot of work on that, and so we do have a pretty good solid system, I would say, right now. So it's a combination of right now, right? Councilman Thompson, if you mentioned, you know, about the reconstruction, there's a good discussion we should have on how we are, you know, with assessments and fees and everything like that. And when you're doing fees, what it's going to be restricted to. Are we going to dedicate it just to streets and things like that? And what our policy is right now. Our policy for mill and overlays in general is to go from bounce around to each ward. It's about the science, but that's how we distribute the general funds accordingly throughout the city and everything. So, but there's always, like I said, I probably recommend when you got the streets, we got the utilities, but having a little bit more comprehensive. We're going to have to try to figure out how to bring that all together a little bit more to get what we want to achieve. But this is a great step moving forward. So, but there you have the presentation. Read through it. If you have any questions, let me know. If I don't know, I'll contact one of these two ladies here to help us out and everything with that. So,
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Can I just make a side note?
Certainly.
So be thinking about what PCI you think the city should have, because that's going to weigh into our budget process each year as we go. And we'll come back and we'll talk about, like Brian was saying, the franchise fees and that 5-year assumption I made for increasing our street funding as well. And certainly we'll talk about that more as we talk about all our projects. But I think we'll have to come back and dig into that so we have some goals.
Franchise fee just $1 for
That's this assumption.
gas and every
and or
Or-
whatever you want.
No, but the 144 you came up with.
Yeah, I think that was $1 on gas, $1 on electric, one on each.
Right.
So 2 total,
Yes.
right?
Yep, that's correct.
Yep. And some cities put, the same, 1 on one, 1 on the other, or 3 on one and 4 on another.
And we
Or
can
one on
determine.
and none on the other. You can do
Right.
that too if you want it, yeah.
Scott, did you have a question or comment?
When you said, think about what PCI we'd like to have, if we could get a copy of this map that's on page 8, that's a little larger, and we could actually go out and drive on these streets and say, this is acceptable or not. So if it's possible to get that
Yep.
in a
You send that
scale
out.
that we could read, that would be very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, it's part of the city.
There's a
tour.
couple landmarks, but-
There'll be a final report that the map will be included in, but I can send that to Brian this week, yep.
Yeah, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, we just
Thank you.
mentioned,
Probably wish-
probably be in touch before you know it.
Yeah.
So,
Thank
thank you.
We actually contacted Otter Power for the numbers
comment.
and
No,
Great
no,
Plains
we're good.
Natural Gas for number of accounts. So we didn't just arbitrarily pick, we worked with the two utility companies to come up with estimated accounts that would have that dollar fee on
And there are more electric than gas.
it. Yeah,
Everybody's got electric.
correct.
Not everybody's got gas.